So Newton makes the world in which Franklin becomes a scientist. And I want to talk about that for a little bit, or for the most part, quote somebody else about what Newton does to change the world. So here we go. For what had science revealed? Everywhere, design, order, and law, where hitherto there had been chaos. What Newton does is make the universe comprehensible. He makes it orderly. He makes it mathematical. Where before it had just been this chaotic mystery, Newton explains it. And the brilliance of Newton is that he explains it so simply. And because his simple explanation works so beautifully well, it's that he makes this simplicity beautiful. In addition, quote some more, whether one contemplated the infinitely great through the optic glass of the Tuscan artist, Galileo's telescope in other words, or the infinitely little through the microscope, one received at every turn new assurance that all was according to mathematics. Another quotation. It was not the ambiguity of nature which people felt most strongly. It was rather the clarity, the authority, and the universal acceptability of nature and nature's laws. The laws of nature are the laws of reason. They are always and everywhere the same. And like the axioms of mathematics, they have only to be presented in order to be acknowledged as just and right by all men. And finally this, what Newton does is change not only science, but produce a climate of opinion in which supernatural explanations of natural phenomena cease to satisfy. And the universe became more and more to be regarded as the great machine working by rigidly determined laws of material causation. The supernatural was banished from nature. That distancing from God, that new emphasis on measurement. If something's real, it's because you can weigh it, you can count it, you can calculate its speed. That's how you know something's real. That's the revolution that Newton and scientists of the 1600s bring into the world of the 1700s, the world of Benjamin Franklin. So that's I think the appeal of science to Franklin. Franklin had already rejected Puritanism, but he hadn't really replaced it with anything as far as explaining and ordering the universe went. Science does that for him, and I think that's the great appeal to Franklin of science. And in addition, Franklin's a very, very practical guy, and the practicality of science, the ability to apply science to different problems, I think also greatly appealed to him too. The same thing that made him entrepreneurial made him a scientist. He loved usefulness. Here's a quotation from him about his own inventions. As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours. And this we should do freely and generously. And he lived up to that. Franklin never made a penny from any of his inventions. And let's talk about them a little bit. Franklin's one of the discoverers of the Gulf Stream. Franklin sailed across the ocean a number of times, back and forth to London mostly, but he also spent years in France. And because he was such a curious guy, and because he was such an affable and sociable creature, he talked a lot to the sailors, and he began to wonder about why it was that it was faster to sail east than it was to sail west. He became curious about the difference in temperature in the ocean, did a lot of experiments measuring the temperature of water in different parts of the ocean, and winds up as one of the people that first discovers and charts the Gulf Stream. And that's just something he did as a sidelight while he was happened to be killing time crossing the ocean. He's the inventor of the Franklin stove in 1742. He's concerned, and he's not the only person worried about this in the 1800s, the 1700s, that too much heat is escaping straight up chimneys. So he thinks of a way to solve the problem, and what he does is basically moves the fire out of the chimney and into the room. That's what the Franklin stove is. It's kind of an extension of the chimney, and so it radiates heat in 360 degrees, and then there's a flue that goes back up the chimney. So he invents an improved stove. Very famous for the invention of the lightning rod in 1750. The lightning rod is a practical result of his famous experiments with electricity and his famous discovery that lightning was electrical. And that leads us to Franklin's great achievement as a scientist. And I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about his life first. We had him moving to Philadelphia at in 1723 when he was 17 years old. And he goes to work as a printer, the trade he learned from his brother. And he works very hard, and Franklin's a very, very able man. And he's great at making friends and making connections. He's great at networking, to use a modern term. And he gets appointed as the public printer to the Philadelphia Assembly. In other words, he gets all the business coming out of the Philadelphia legislature, the Pennsylvania legislature, produces reams of paper, government does. So he gets a steady income for that. And he just goes on to more and more success as a businessman after that. He begins publishing Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732, and he publishes that through 1757. And Poor Richard's Almanac is famous for all the phrases it uses, the maxims that Franklin invents. Keep thy shop, and thy shop will keep thee. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A bird in hand is worth two in the bush. God helps those who help themselves. A penny saved is a penny earned. That's all Franklin. He's one of the most quoted people in American history. He made those little maxims and sayings up to put in his almanac. He publishes a newspaper for a while. He's the clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly for a while. And he begins experimenting with electricity in 1746, and in 1748 retires from business. He's only 42 years old. He retires to pursue his scientific pursuits full time. And that leads to the publication of the Experiments and Observation on Electricity, and that makes him internationally famous. Now imagine that. This guy has no education. He lives in a small city at the provincial edge of the English-speaking world. He's a nobody from nowhere by European standards, but he becomes a famous scientist anyway. Here's an illustration from the book. Experiments and Observations on Electricity is a major work in the history of electricity. It makes Franklin a Fellow of the Royal Society. That's the top-notch society for English-speaking scientists. Newton had been a fellow, and he becomes one of those in 1756. And there he is, flying the famous kite. Good way to get electrocuted. And Franklin was lucky he didn't get electrocuted. Here's another one of his inventions. It just shows how dynamic this guy's mind was. This is a musical instrument, the glass harmonica. And you see these glass cylinders here. Those things are all tuned. And what you don't see is the bottom half of those cylinders are resting in water. So the way the glass harmonica was played, somebody would turn the crank there on the right, and all the cylinders would spin, and it would be like rubbing your finger around the edge of a wine glass. Each one of those is tuned to a different note, and the musician could play the harmonica and produce that kind of sound and make music out of it. It's a popular instrument for a while. I believe Handel actually composes for the glass harmonica. And he's also famous for the invention of bifocals. As Franklin aged, he found that he had difficulty reading and also had difficulty with nearsightedness, and bifocals solved the problem for him. He's the inventor of those. Okay, in addition to being a scientist, Franklin's also a very useful citizen. I've already given examples of many of those things. He is a very good citizen. He is a very civic-minded person. He's a very public duty-minded person. Talked about the Pennsylvania Gazette already, that he purchases and then publishes for many years. Poor Richard's Almanac. His involvement in Pennsylvania. Politics is, I guess, the right word, but Franklin wasn't a politician. He's never elected anything except as a delegate to the Continental Congress. He does not run for elective office. He was too much of a businessman for that. He was too concerned with getting along with everybody, and Franklin famously did. Everybody liked him. And if you're going to politics and join a party, everybody doesn't like you. You wind up with enemies that way. So he's a very political creature, but he wasn't a politician. He does, however, become the colonial agent to England, first for Pennsylvania and then for a number of other colonies. And he spends a lot of time in this quasi-diplomatic role trying to argue Pennsylvania's case in London to court. And that prepares him for the roles he's going to play in the American Revolution.